The courtroom echoed with sneers as a husband's high-priced attorney waved her empty bank statements like a victory flag. They called her a broke, desperate housewife, clinging to a tycoon's scraps. But the smirking billionaire had no idea the silent woman beside him was about to financially bury him alive. The heavy oak doors of courtroom 302 in the Cook County Circuit Court swung shut, effectively sealing the stifling tension inside. Morning sunlight filtered through the tall, arched windows, casting long shadows across the polished mahogany tables. But the atmosphere was anything but warm. Judge Madeline Rostover, a jurist famously intolerant of courtroom theatrics, adjusted her silver-rimmed glasses as she stared down at the towering stack of financial exhibits presented by the respondent's legal counsel. At the defense table sat Richard Sterling, dressed in a bespoke charcoal bryony suit. His posture exuded the relaxed, untouchable arrogance of a man entirely accustomed to getting his way. Richard was the CEO and founder of Sterling Prestige Group, a formidable real estate development firm that had dominated the Chicago skyline for the better part of a decade. Beside him stood his lead counsel, Harrison Caldwell, a senior partner at the ruthless, high-powered firm of Caldwell, Price & Associates. Caldwell was a shark in a silk tie, a man who charged $1,000 an hour to verbally eviscerate anyone standing between his billionaire clients and their assets. Across the aisle, sitting in stark contrast at the plaintiff's table, was Sylvia Montgomery. For 14 years she had been Mrs. Richard Sterling. Today she was simply the obstacle. Sylvia wore a modest, tailored navy dress. Her posture was rigidly straight, her expression an unreadable mask of absolute calm. She didn't fidget. She didn't weep. She merely watched the proceedings with cold, analytical eyes. Beside her sat Jonathan Hayes, a senior litigator from Hayes & Covington. Unlike Caldwell, who commanded the room with booming theatricality, Hayes was quiet, methodical, and currently occupied with meticulously organizing a single, slim manila folder on the table before him. "Your Honor," Caldwell's voice suddenly boomed, echoing off the wood-paneled walls as he began his opening arguments regarding the division of assets. "We are here today to resolve what should be a remarkably simple dissolution of marriage. My client, Mr. Sterling, is a man of industry, a visionary who built an empire from the ground up through 80-hour work weeks and unparalleled business acumen." Caldwell paused, turning slowly on his heel to look directly at Sylvia. A patronizing smile touched the corners of his mouth. "And then we have the plaintiff, Sylvia Montgomery, a woman who for 14 years has contributed absolutely nothing of financial substance to this union. She has not held a W-2 job since 2011. She has not invested capital. She has not generated revenue." Caldwell walked over to the evidence stand and picked up a blown-up, poster-sized printout of a bank statement. He tapped it with a telescoping pointer. "Let the record reflect Exhibit 4A. This is a snapshot of the plaintiff's personal checking account, seized and audited as of the 1st of this month. The balance, Your Honor, is $42.16. Furthermore, we have audited her secondary savings accounts. The total liquid capital to her name is less than $3,000. She is, by every financial metric recognized by the state of Illinois, entirely broke." A low murmur rippled through the gallery. Richard leaned back in his leather chair, crossing his legs, unable to hide his smirk. He leaned over and whispered something into his junior associate's ear, prompting a suppressed chuckle from the young lawyer. "My client has been exceedingly generous," Caldwell continued, pacing the floor. "For a decade and a half, he provided Mrs. Sterling with a life of unmitigated luxury. Penthouses on the Gold Coast, winters in Aspen, a black card with a limitless ceiling. But let us not confuse generosity with entitlement. The plaintiff filed for this divorce. She chose to walk away from the table, and now she sits before this court demanding a 50% liquidation of Sterling Prestige Group, a demand that is not only mathematically absurd, but financially ruinous. Judge Rostova peered over her spectacles. Mr. B. Caldwell, the state of Illinois is an equitable distribution state. Marital assets are divided fairly, taking into account the duration of the marriage and the standard of living established. Fairly, Your Honor, is the operative word. Caldwell countered smoothly. Sterling Prestige Group is currently navigating a highly sensitive restructuring phase. The commercial real estate market is volatile. To liquidate assets now to satisfy the exorbitant alimony demands of a woman who brings nothing to the table would bankrupt the company. We're offering a lump sum settlement of $2 million. A staggering windfall for someone with $42 to her name. $2 million. It was a fraction of Richard's net worth, which Forbes had recently estimated at nearly $800 million. It was a calculated, insulting lowball designed to force Sylvia into submission. Sylvia didn't blink. She reached out, picking up a silver Mont Blanc pen, and calmly wrote a single line on her legal pad. She pushed it toward Jonathan Hayes. Hayes glanced at it, a faint, almost imperceptible smile touching his lips. He gave her a single nod. Your Honor, Caldwell wrapped up, adjusting his cuffs. The plaintiff is destitute. She has no career, no assets, and no leverage. We respectfully request the court compel her to accept the settlement offer. She is holding my client's empire hostage for a payday she did not earn. Caldwell returned to his seat, looking thoroughly pleased with himself. Richard clapped him on the shoulder. They had painted the perfect picture. The benevolent titan of industry and the greedy, helpless gold digger holding her hand out for a blank check. Judge Rostova sighed, turning her attention to the plaintiff's table. Mr. Hayes, I assume you have a rebuttal, or are we moving straight to witness testimony? Jonathan Hayes stood up slowly. He didn't carry any posters. He didn't pace. He simply buttoned his suit jacket and looked directly at the judge. We will bypass the opening rebuttal, Your Honor, Hayes said, his voice mild and polite. In fact, we agree with much of what Mr. Caldwell has stated. Caldwell frowned, exchanging a confused look with Richard. We agree that Mr. Sterling has built an empire, Hayes continued. We agree that the commercial real estate market is highly volatile. And we completely agree that my client's personal checking account currently holds exactly $42.16. Richard barked a short, arrogant laugh. Even Judge Rostova looked momentarily baffled. Mr. Hayes, are you conceding to the defense's settlement offer? Absolutely not, Your Honor, Hayes replied, his tone suddenly shifting from mild to razor-sharp. Because Mr. Caldwell's assessment is based on a fundamentally flawed premise. He believes my client is asking for half of Sterling Prestige Group. She isn't. Hayes picked up his slim manila folder. If it pleases the court, I would like to call Richard Sterling to the stand. Richard Sterling strode to the witness stand with the swagger of a man walking onto a golf course. He took the oath, sat down and adjusted the microphone, shooting a condescending glare at his soon-to-be ex-wife. Sylvia met his gaze with chilling indifference. Jonathan Hayes approached the podium, resting his hands on the wooden edges. Mr. Sterling, good morning. Let's talk about your company. Sterling Prestige Group. You are the sole voting shareholder, correct? I am, Richard said proudly. I built it from the ground up. Impressive. And your flagship property, the Sapphire Tower in downtown Chicago that's currently under construction, isn't it? A magnificent 70-story mixed-use high-rise. It will be the crown jewel of the city, Richard beamed. I'm sure it will be, Hayes nodded. However, commercial real estate is an expensive game. Building skyscrapers requires immense capital. Capital that, According to your own financial disclosures submitted to this court, Sterling Prestige Group did not have in cash. You leveraged heavily to finance the Sapphire Tower, didn't you? Caldwell stood up. Objection, Your Honor. Relevance: we have already submitted the corporate debt ledgers. This is public knowledge. Overruled, Judge Rostover said, leaning forward, suddenly intrigued by Hayes's line of questioning. I'll allow it, but get to the point, Counselor. Thank you, Your Honor, Hayes said. Mr. Sterling, you took out a mezzanine loan of $450 million to complete the Sapphire Tower. A high-risk, high-interest loan. Who was the original underwriter for that debt? Richard waved his hand dismissively. A private equity firm out of New York. Blackwood Capital. Correct, Hayes said. He opened his folder and pulled out a single sheet of paper. And are you aware of a clause in your contract with Blackwood Capital, specifically Section 4, Paragraph B, that allows the lender to sell your debt to a third-party holding company at their discretion? Thou. Richard narrowed his eyes, his smugness faltering slightly. It's standard boilerplate language in commercial lending. Lenders offload risk all the time. It doesn't change the terms of my repayment. No, it doesn't change the terms, Hayes agreed smoothly. But it does change who you answer to. Now, Mr. Sterling, your company is heavily over-leveraged. You testified earlier through your counsel that liquidating assets to pay my client would bankrupt you. This is because your debt-to-equity ratio is currently sitting at a perilous 92%. If your primary lender decided to call in the loan early, due to a covenant breach, say, a drop in your personal liquidity caused by a messy divorce, you would lose the Sapphire Tower, wouldn't you? Objection. Speculation, Caldwell shouted, half standing. Sustained, Rostover said. Mr. Hayes, frame your questions carefully. My apologies, Your Honor, Hayes said without breaking eye contact with Richard. Mr. Sterling, when did you last check the ownership status of your debt? Richard scoffed. I have a CFO for that. Blackwood holds the paper. They held the paper, Hayes corrected, his voice dropping an octave, carrying through the dead-silent courtroom. I would like to submit Exhibit C into evidence, Your Honor. Copies have been provided to the defense. Hayes handed a stack of heavily stamped legal documents to the bailiff, who distributed them to the judge and to a suddenly pale Harrison Caldwell. What you are looking at, Hayes announced to the room, are legally binding transfer deeds dated 14 days ago. Blackwood Capital opted to liquidate their high-risk portfolio. They sold the entirety of the $450 million mezzanine debt attached to the Sapphire Tower. Richard gripped the edges of the witness stand. Sold it. To who? To a private equity firm incorporated in Delaware, operating under the name Aegis Vanguard Group, Hayes answered. Caldwell furiously flipped through the pages, his face flushing crimson. Your Honor, this is an ambush. These documents have nothing to do with the marital assets. They have everything to do with it, Mr. Caldwell, Hayes snapped, his quiet demeanor vanishing in an instant. He turned his piercing gaze back to Richard. Because, Mr. Sterling, Aegis Vanguard Group didn't just buy the debt on the Sapphire Tower. Over the last 8 months, while you were entirely focused on hiding your liquid assets and transferring funds to offshore accounts to ensure my client got nothing, Aegis Vanguard quietly bought up the paper on your Gold Coast penthouses. They bought the commercial mortgage on your corporate headquarters. They even bought the lien on your private jet. The courtroom erupted into frantic whispering. Judge Rostover slammed her gavel. Order! Order in this court. Richard was breathing heavily, his eyes darting between his lawyer and Hayes. It doesn't matter who holds the debt. As long as I make the quarterly payments, the assets are mine. But that's the tragedy of your situation, Richard, Hayes said softly, stepping right up to the witness stand. You missed a payment 3 days ago. You diverted $5 million from your operating capital into a shell account in the Cayman Islands to hide it from this divorce proceeding. We have the wire transfers. By doing so, you fell short on your quarterly obligation to Aegis Vanguard." Richard's face drained of all color. He looked like a man who had just stepped off a cliff and was waiting to hit the ground. "And according to the aggressive default covenanters you signed," Hayes continued mercilessly, "missing a payment allows the debt holder to immediately call in the principal in full, $450 million, due today. This is extortion." Caldwell roared, abandoning all decorum. "Who is behind Aegis Vanguard? Who gave them the capital to buy $500 million in distressed debt?" Hayes didn't look at Caldwell. He turned slowly and looked at Sylvia. She was still sitting perfectly upright, her hands folded neatly on the table. She looked back at her lawyer and gave him that same imperceptible nod. "To answer your question, Mr. Caldwell," Hayes said, his voice echoing in the stunned silence of the room. He pulled the final page from his manila folder. "The initial seed funding for Aegis Vanguard Group was provided by a quiet, anonymous angel investor who made a fortune shorting the tech market in 2018. That investor transferred the entirety of the firm's voting shares to its sole proprietor and CEO exactly 48 hours ago." Hayes turned back to the judge, holding up the incorporation document. "Your Honor, the sole owner, CEO, and controlling shareholder of Aegis Vanguard Group, the entity that currently owns every single asset Richard Sterling falsely claimed he built alone, is the plaintiff." Hayes paused, letting the silence stretch until it was almost deafening. Sylvia Montgomery. For 10 agonizing seconds, the only sound in courtroom 302 was the hum of the air conditioning unit and the frantic, shallow breathing of Harrison Caldwell. Judge Madeline Rostova stared at the incorporation documents of Aegis Vanguard Group, her seasoned eyes tracking the ink that effectively flipped the power dynamic of $1 billion divorce on its head. "This is a parlor trick," Caldwell suddenly shouted, his booming voice cracking under the strain of sudden panic. He slammed his hand flat against the mahogany defense table. "Your Honor, this is a flagrant violation of discovery. If the plaintiff is the CEO and sole shareholder of the private equity firm holding $500 million in assets, that firm is marital property subject to equitable division." Jonathan Hayes didn't even flinch. He buttoned his suit jacket and turned to face Caldwell with the serene patience of a teacher correcting a slow student. "I expected better from a senior partner at Caldwell and Price," Hayes replied, his voice a lethal, quiet drawl. "Perhaps you should look at the dates on those transfer deeds, Harrison. Aegis Vanguard Group was incorporated in Delaware 3 months ago by a third party. The initial seed capital, $600 million, was provided entirely by Sylvia's older brother, Arthur Montgomery. Richard's head snapped up. "Arthur? Arthur is a math professor in Boston. He drives a 10-year-old Volvo." "Arthur was a math professor," Hayes corrected smoothly, "until he took early retirement in 2019 to run a private family office. He is also the anonymous whale who partnered with real-world short sellers like Jim Chanos to aggressively short the commercial tech sector just before the market corrected. Your brother-in-law is quietly worth over $2 billion, Richard. You would have known that if you had ever bothered to ask him about his life during Thanksgiving dinner, instead of lecturing him about your golf handicap." Laughter rippled through the gallery. Judge Rostova slammed her gavel, though a faint smile played on her own lips. "Quiet. Proceed, Mr. Hayes." "Thank you, Your Honor," Hayes continued. "Arthur Montgomery formed Aegis Vanguard with his own capital. It is legally his entity. However, 48 hours ago, which I will remind the court is exactly 1 year and 2 days after the legal date of separation between my client and Mr. Cord, Sterling Arthur gifted the voting shares of Aegis Vanguard to his sister. Because the shares were acquired well after the date of separation, and gifted from a non-marital source, they are explicitly legally classified as sole and separate property. Richard Sterling has zero claim to Aegis Vanguard. Caldwell looked as though he had been physically struck. He frantically whispered to his junior associate, pointing at the legal texts scattered on their table, but the young lawyer only shook his head, looking terrified. "But the debt," Richard stammered, his bespoke charcoal suit suddenly looking 2 sizes too big for him. "She bought the debt on my company. She can't just call it in." "Actually she can," Hayes said, leaning against the plaintiff's table. "As we established earlier, Mr. Sterling, you missed your quarterly mezzanine payment. You diverted $5 million of operating capital to a shell account at the Cayman National Bank under the name Blue Horizon Holdings. We have the SWIFT codes, the wire receipts, and the IP logs of you authorizing the transfer from your laptop at the Soho house." Hayes picked up another piece of paper. "Because you illegally hid those funds to starve my client out during this divorce, your corporate accounts fell short. You technically defaulted on the $450 million loan originally issued by Blackwood Capital. Aegis Vanguard, as the new owner of that debt, is simply exercising its contractual right to demand immediate repayment of the principal in full." Richard's chest heaved. He looked at Sylvia, his eyes wide with a mixture of horror, betrayal, and awe. The woman he had dismissed as a trophy wife. A woman he had gleefully humiliated by submitting her $42 bank statement to the public record, had spent the last 8 months quietly orchestrating his total annihilation. "You set me up," Richard hissed across the aisle, his voice vibrating with venom. "You knew I was moving that money. You timed the debt acquisition perfectly. You waited for me to trip the wire." For the first time since the trial began, Sylvia Montgomery moved. She slowly reached up, smoothed a stray lock of hair behind her ear, and turned her head to look her husband dead in the eye. "I didn't set you up, Richard," Sylvia spoke. Her voice was like crushed ice, smooth, elegant, and chillingly cold. "I simply stopped protecting you from your own greed." Caldwell wiped a bead of sweat from his forehead. "Your Honor, we ask for an immediate recess. The defense needs time to review these documents and consult with bankruptcy counsel." "Bankruptcy counsel?" Richard barked, spinning on his lawyer. "I am not declaring bankruptcy. I am Richard Sterling. I own the Chicago skyline." "You own a mountain of toxic debt, Mr. Sterling," Judge Rostova interjected, her tone dropping all pretense of judicial neutrality. "And from where I am sitting, your primary creditor is sitting right across from you. I am going to grant a 2-hour recess. I strongly suggest you use that time to come to an arrangement with the plaintiff, because if she formally files for breach of covenant, this court will have no choice but to authorize the seizure of your assets to satisfy the debt." Rostova banged her gavel. "Court is in recess until 1 o'clock. The courthouse conference room smelled of stale coffee and desperation. Richard paced the length of the narrow space like a caged animal, his tie yanked loose, his hair disheveled. Harrison Caldwell sat at the table, his head buried in his hands, surrounded by the ruins of his client's financial empire. The door clicked open, and Sylvia walked in, followed closely by Jonathan Hayes. She took a seat at the head of the table, crossing her legs, looking as fresh and composed as she had at 9 o'clock that morning. "Get out," Richard snarled at Hayes. "I want to talk to my wife alone." "Mr. Hayes stays," Sylvia said flatly. "And I am not your wife, Richard. Not anymore. I am the CEO of Aegis Vanguard, and currently I am the woman who owns the deed to your office building, your penthouse, your private jet, and the Sapphire Tower." Richard slammed his hands on the table, leaning over her. "You think you're a genius, Sylvia. You think Arthur's little hedge fund trick is going to ruin me. I'll tie this up in litigation for 10 years. I'll call Morgan Stanley." I'll get a bridge loan. I'll pay off Aegis Vanguard and leave you with nothing but legal fees." Sylvia didn't flinch. She just smiled a small, pitying smile that made Richard's blood run cold. "Call them," Sylvia whispered. Richard blinked. "What?" "Call Morgan Stanley. Call Goldman. Call any underwriter on Wall Street," Sylvia invited, gesturing to the phone on the table. "Tell them you need a $500 million bailout because you defaulted on a high-risk mezzanine loan after illegally diverting corporate funds to the Cayman Islands to hide money from a family court judge." Richard froze. "Jonathan didn't just subpoena those wire transfers, Richard," Sylvia continued, her voice dangerously soft. "He forwarded them to the Securities and Exchange Commission and to the Cayman Islands Monetary Authority. The accounts are frozen. You are currently under investigation for corporate malfeasance and wire fraud. No reputable bank in the world will touch you." Caldwell let out a long, defeated groan. "She's right, Richard. You're radioactive. If this goes to a foreclosure auction, you lose the company. You lose the voting shares. You lose everything." Richard slumped into a chair, the fight completely draining out of him. He looked at the woman he had spent 14 years underestimating. Why? Why go to all this trouble? If you wanted half, you could have just fought for it normally. "Because you didn't want to give me half," Sylvia said, her eyes flashing with a sudden, fierce fire. "You wanted to break me. You stood up there and let your attack dog call me a useless, broke housewife. You forgot, Richard, who proofread every one of your contracts for the first 7 years of our marriage. You forgot who smoothed over the investors when you threw temper tantrums. I didn't just host your charity galas. I built the social capital that kept your house of cards standing. And you thought you could toss me aside with $42 to my name." She signaled to Hayes, who opened his briefcase and slid a thick legal document across the table. "So here is your settlement offer," Sylvia said. "Aegis Vanguard will restructure your debt. We will not call in the principal today." Richard looked up, a glimmer of pathetic hope in his eyes. "You'll restructure? On my terms," Sylvia countered. "Aegis Vanguard takes 80% of the voting shares of Sterling Prestige Group. We take the title to the Sapphire Tower. We take the Gold Coast penthouse, and we take the Gulf Stream. You get to keep 20% of the company, your title as a minority partner, and the house in Aspen. Oh, and you will pay my legal fees. All of them." Caldwell gasped. "That's a corporate hijacking." "You're leaving him with pennies on the dollar. I'm leaving him with a job and a roof over his head," Sylvia corrected sharply, "which is significantly more than the $2 million insult he offered me this morning. You have exactly 10 minutes to sign this, Richard. If you don't, we go back into that courtroom, I file the default notices, and by Friday, Forbes will be running a cover story on the total liquidation of your empire." Richard stared at the contract. His hands were shaking. He looked at Caldwell, silently begging his shark of a lawyer to find a loophole, a trapdoor, anything. But Caldwell just looked away. There was no way out. The checkmate was absolute. Slowly, with the crushing weight of a man signing his own death warrant, Richard reached for his silver Mont Blanc pen. He uncapped it, hesitated for one agonizing second, and scrawled his name on the dotted line. Sylvia took the document, inspected the signature, and handed it to Hayes. She stood up, smoothing the front of her navy dress. "Pleasure doing business with you, Mr. Sterling," Sylvia said. She turned and walked out of the conference room, her heels clicking rhythmically against the marble floor. She walked out of the courthouse and into the bright Chicago sunlight, stepping into the back of a waiting black town car. She pulled out her phone, opened her banking app, and glanced at the screen. Her personal checking account still read exactly $42.16. But as the car pulled away, heading toward her new corporate headquarters, Sylvia Montgomery had never felt richer in her life. Did Sylvia's ultimate revenge leave you speechless? This mastermind proved that hell hath no fury like a woman underestimated, especially when she secretly holds the keys to the kingdom. If you loved seeing this arrogant billionaire get exactly what he deserved, smash that like button and share this incredible story. Subscribe to our channel for more jaw-dropping true-life courtroom dramas and explosive financial twists you won't want to miss.